The life of Baron Ungern-Sternberg is steeped in legend. As is the case with many of history's most conspicuous men, he appears to have been born at the wrong time. The Baron dreamed of assembling a new Mongolian horde. He aimed to revive the great empire of Genghis Khan under a Buddhist flag, paired with the Russian imperial eagle, to be called the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire, an empire that designated Europe as the birthplace of everything soft and weak, a once strong monarchical bastion that withered away under a series of peasant revolts. And thus this Buddhist empire was to destroy Europe, to weed out its greed and corruption, and amid its ruins elevate a new ruling class, a divine monarch imbued with the immortal spirit of Genghis Khan and his obedient, chaste, sober warrior aristocracy. This was the vision that Baron Ungern shared with his closest associates as he brutally ravaged his way through Mongolia and the Transbaikal. None of this came to be. The ambitions of the Baron were cut short by the Soviets, who executed him in 1921, and yet in certain corners of the Eastern world, it is said that the Baron still charges through the steppes, unaffected by death, for he is an incarnation of Baekje, a divine lord of war and protector of the esoteric Buddhist faith. It is difficult to accept that such extravagant ambitions were espoused and taken seriously only some 100 years ago. That a Russified Baltic German noble could be elevated to the status of Khan in the Far East and be considered seriously immortal. A god of war that arrived at the perfect moment to harness the ideological apocalypse of the 20th century. And yet, Baron Ungern planted his mythological banner so close to us, and so successfully. Even in his lifetime, having seen almost nothing but constant battle and movement, he turned into a Eurasian myth. The bloody white baron who comes for you from the east, seeking to rule over you like a dark deity of old. However, beyond the myth and folk tales, there is historical record, out of which a timeline of the baron's life can be assembled and made comprehensible, at least to some extent. We can never truly understand what drives nomadic and erratic men who enjoy war in the same way that a gambler loves gambling, or in the way that an adulterer seeks constant new affairs. However, we try to understand, even if for no other reason than simple fascination with the mysterious and morbid. It is our aim today to make the Baron comprehensible, to present an image of his life as a whole, and no aspect of this life can be ignored. We have to wade through truth, propaganda, legend, and record-keeping error without always knowing what is true. Only the Baron himself can ultimately know this. What remains for us is a distorted fantasy, but this modern fantasy is worth hearing. The life of Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg can be split into two periods, the Imperial period and the White Army period. In the former, which lasts from his birth until the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Baron is slowly but violently shaping and showing his behavioral tendencies. He undeniably stands out during this time, but were his life to end during the revolution, as it did for many high-ranking imperial soldiers, he would have most likely been forgotten by everybody except the historians of the 20th century Russian Empire period. It is in the White Army period following the Bolshevik Revolution that the Baron sealed himself truly as an unforgettable part of history, regardless of how his influence is evaluated and whether his activity had any historical consequence at all. His life until 1917 must be viewed as a rehearsal for what is to come. The answers to many of the questions surrounding his later activity and beliefs are to be found in his youth. Baron Ungern was born into a historical line of nobility that settled in modern-day Estonia during the Middle Ages, at least on his father's side. His mother was German, born in Stuttgart in 1861 to a long line of noble ancestors, the Barons of Wimpfen in the Baden-Württemberg region of southern Germany. His father, born in 1857, traced his ancestry to the originator of the Ungern line, a 13th century vassal to a Latvian archbishop. According to Ungern himself, dozens of his ancestors proved themselves on the battlefields of Europe. He saw his ancestry as predominantly warrior aristocratic, and he considered this mode of life and birth to be the bare minimum. No individual below the title of Baron was worth any consideration. It is also important to add that through his father, the Baron had some Hungarian blood, and through this he claimed direct descent from Genghis Khan himself, by way of his grandson Batu Khan, who had devastated the Hungarian army in 1241 at the Battle of Mohi. The Mongolians never properly established themselves in Hungary and had withdrawn in the following year, but for Ungern this was enough to try and claim descent. The Baron's father had a great interest in geology, and this interest found the family traveling very often to various geological sites throughout Europe. In the 6th year of their marriage, finding themselves in Austria in late 1885, the couple had a son. A record-keeping error dates the birth of this child to the 22nd of January 1886, when in fact this child was born on the 29th of December 1885. Later, when Russia adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1918, a converted date was also proposed, the 10th of January 1886. Thus, this child entered the world seemingly destined for mystery, for even his date of birth could not be properly ascertained within his lifetime. This child was given a name in line with the traditions of the Baltic German nobility, Nikolai Robert Maximilian Baron von Ungern-Sternberg. Within 2 years of the Baron's birth, the family moved to Reval, Tallinn in modern-day Estonia, which at the time was a province of the sweeping Russian Empire. This is where the Ungern-Sternberg branch of the family kept finding itself since the Middle Ages. Nothing is known about these most formative years of the child's development. However, in 1891, his parents got divorced. It is said that the Baron's father was very distant, willingly overworking himself in the geology sphere. The family had lost 2 infants, one before the Baron's birth and one after, a girl, the Baron's sister. As these deaths occurred in the household, his father continued taking further trips to the Caucasus in the name of study, and hence the family, quite rapidly, fell apart. It is up to the viewer to decide whether such events had an effect on the young Baron. The Baron's mother remarried within some years into the Göningen-Güne Baltic German noble family, and the Baron continued to grow up on this family's estate in Estonia, in manors and lake houses surrounded by deep forests. At this time, he attended the gymnasium of Nicholas I, the oldest gymnasium on the territory of the Russian Empire, originally a German-speaking institution, but, as it is with all empires, the imperial language was taught more and more actively, and with every year, more and more relocated Russians enrolled their children into this school. Within 2 very brief years of attendance, the Baron displayed the most immense aversion to discipline, which would follow him throughout his entire turbulent life. Both his school record and his attendance left much to be desired, and in 1902 the Baron was expelled from the gymnasium. Writing this off as an unsuitable environment for the youth, and seeing his already forming interest in military matters, the Baron's stepfather wrote a letter of recommendation to the Naval Cadet Corps in St. Petersburg, established by Peter the Great himself in 1701. Here, if everything went well, the 17-year-old Baron would be trained to become a prestigious naval officer, available for commissioning in the Imperial Russian Navy. Nothing about the Baron's academic performance changed in this school. The great discipline required to forge a naval officer only provoked the young Baron to further acts of defiance. Academically, he found himself in the bottom 5% of his class, and accrued more than 20 disciplinary warnings per year for his behavior. His classmates quickly came to regard him as a violent young man, unafraid to sort out any interpersonal confusion through fisticuffs. The Baron made it a habit to remind people around him that he comes of great German descent, that 72 of his ancestors had fallen on the battlefields of Eurasia in service of the eternal Russian Empire, and he spent much of his time studying philosophy in his room instead of attending his military training classes. This behavior continued to get worse over the next 3 years, and having squandered every opportunity to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the faculty, The Naval Cadet Corps informed his parents that they must willingly withdraw the 20-year-old Baron from the school, or they will be forced to publicly expel him and tarnish the Ungern-Sternberg name yet again. The parents agreed to deal with this discreetly, and the young Baron was left with no prospects, if only for a short time. In fact, the Baron got lucky, in a sense. Fate seemed to have served him a perfect opportunity to channel the warrior aristocrat pride that had been boiling in him for so long. By the time that the Baron was withdrawn from the Naval Cadet Corps, the Russo-Japanese War had completed its first year. The future was uncertain for the eastern theater of the Russian Empire, and the Baron decided to volunteer for the war effort as a radical change to his lifestyle up until this point. After all, the best warriors are forged through practice. The Baron was assigned to the 91st Dvinsky Infantry Regiment as a volunteer, but upon finding out that this regiment would not be going to the front after all, he requested to be reassigned to a Cossack regiment specifically. The Cossacks were a predominantly cavalry-based military unit, made up of historically nomadic peoples of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. It is wrong to think of the Cossack. Every major ruler of Eastern Europe eventually faced a choice: to exterminate these highly effective horseback communities in aims of preventing constant border raids, or to assimilate them into the grander state. The problem with assimilation, however, is that a historically nomadic peoples will always be reluctant to settle down and abide by imposed rules. The geopolitical theater of Eastern Europe was already expending itself through constant wars between the major powers, and so adding a taxing campaign of brutal subjugation to the late medieval agenda was utterly nonsensical. Unavoidably, a compromise was reached, each tendencies of his bloodline, to make war brutally and effectively. Unfortunately, the Baron's request could not be fulfilled, and he was finally attached to the 12th Velikolutsky Infantry Regiment, intended for the southern Manchurian theater of the Russo-Japanese conflict. By the time that the regiment arrived in Manchuria, this conflict was over. The Baron, unfortunately, did not get to participate in anything more than a handful of local, short-lived skirmishes. Disappointed by how little of a taste he had gotten of great glory, the Baron made his journey back to St. Petersburg. It is of utmost importance to highlight a certain event that occurred in the Russian Empire while the Baron was making his way to Manchuria. Events that began in January of 1905 culminated in what would be the first major astonishment of the Baron's life, and the confirmation of the beliefs that had been brewing in him for several years. The First Russian Revolution was ablaze, a series of events which culminated in violent peasant uprisings all throughout the empire against the nobles and landlords. Estonia, too, as part of the empire, was swept through by a brutal mob. Countless Baltic German nobles were lynched, their estates looted and burned down. The Baron received written updates on this calamity. Friends of the family were violently killed, heirlooms and valuables of all sorts were taken by force, and one of the Baron's childhood homes had been razed to the ground by the very people who worked on that land for decades. This turn of events cemented into the Baron's mind, and only confirmed his belief that the masses are worth nothing. He said of the rioting peasants, "They are all rough, untutored, wild, and constantly angry, hating everybody and everything without understanding why." In light of the destruction and danger that the Baltic German nobles faced in Estonia, the Baron returned to St. Petersburg, having been promoted to the rank of corporal for his small-scale participation in the Russo-Japanese War. It appears that the Baron's brief stint in an infantry regiment, and perhaps the anger of seeing the monarchy give in to the demands of the very same people who took it upon themselves to lynch their masters, had an inspiring effect. Having twice failed in his attempts to receive an education, the Baron decided to not squander his potential any further, and enrolled into the Pavlovsk Military Academy of St. Petersburg in 1906. He enrolled as an ordinary cadet and, surprisingly, managed to get through this program with somewhat average grades, graduating in 1908. Some believe that the Baron's improved performance was spurred by a taste of war. He was now to train and become an effective infantryman in order to perform to the best of his abilities the next time he finds himself at the front. Any front. Others believed that the peasant revolt in Estonia motivated the Baron to enjoy and take advantage of his noble opportunities, considering that he can be overtaken any day by a discontented mob. Regardless of his motivations, it is during this period that the Baron entrenched himself entirely in theosophy. It is beyond the scope of this essay to give an adequately detailed explanation of this occult tradition. Let it suffice to say that this is a highly esoteric hybrid of Eastern religion and Western philosophy, a blending of East and West that could have only been born from a Russian mind. Yelena Blavatskaya, the founder of this belief system, was a Russian-born traveling mystic who claimed to have received the secrets of synthesizing philosophy, science, and theology in the mountains of Tibet. Following her move to the United States to establish the Theosophical Society, as well as the writing of her theosophical literature in English, she became the first person in US history to formally convert to Buddhism in 1882. The Baron, being fluent in English, studied her works diligently during his 2 years at the Pavlovsk Military Academy, relying on his earlier interest in philosophy proper to act as a guardrail as he treaded the path of esoteric wisdom. It is during these years that the Baron began to foresee a great apocalypse. Even though the Baron eventually converted to Buddhism, he still believed in Christianity throughout his entire life. His studies took on an eschatological form, and his sense for the metaphysical rapidly expanded. With the defeat of the Russian Empire by the Japanese, the first defeat of the empire by an Asian power, a new world tendency was re-emerging from the Far East, a new warring spirit. The Russian monarchy, having given in to the demands of the masses, was evidently growing weak in the eyes of a conservative, and what is weakened must eventually fall. Without a divine monarch, God himself is no longer looking over the land, and the satanic can run amok and perform its wildest machinations. These were the fears forming rapidly in the mind of the 23-year-old Baron, to be written down a decade later in various letters and orders as the Baron looked to wage nothing short of genocide upon the communists in the East. Many locals imagining him as the incarnation of an ancient Buddhist god of war, defending his hybrid Christian-Buddhist faith and war band. It is without a doubt that the young Baron saw something during his brief time in Manchuria. The region took hold of him spiritually and expanded the possibilities for his prior classical Western philosophy self-education. Upon graduating from the military academy in 1908, the Baron requested that he be assigned, yet again, to another Cossack regiment. His wish was granted, and the Baron was attached to the 1st Argunsky Cossack Regiment in eastern Siberia. Here, the young man underwent extensive horseback training under the watchful eye of a very well-accomplished relative, the Lieutenant General Paul von Rennenkampf, who had distinguished himself several times as a commander in the Russo-Japanese War, and would go on to lead the First Army in the invasion of East Prussia in 1914. In 1918, like many other distinguished military nobles, General von Rennenkampf would be executed by the Bolsheviks during the Red Terror. The Baron was reported to have struggled, initially, with the demands of horseback training, but through persistence and the true desire to take part in the lifestyle of the nomadic peoples he was starting to so deeply admire, the Baron allegedly rather quickly became the best cavalryman across all the horseback regiments. However, the demands of discipline and obedience still troubled our young man. Reportedly, the Baron began to drink aggressively, and even though he could behave himself during training, at night, the Baron, in his own words, would drink himself into delirium, and begin to get inappropriately loud and violent with his comrades. The habit of fixing any interpersonal question through physical combat still remained with the Baron, except now the Baron had a saber, and he would swing the saber violently almost every night, blinded by an alcoholic rage. One such time, having offended another soldier during a night of drowning in alcohol, the Baron found himself in a formal duel. The results of this duel are unknown, and it is likely that the two men were separated by their superiors. But the Baron walked away with a major laceration on his forehead, leaving him a recognizable scar for the remainder of his life. This was a deep wound that seems to have penetrated his skull, and it left the Baron with crippling headaches for the rest of his life. In fact, during his final criminal trial, on the basis of this injury, there was an attempt to have him declared insane and thus avoid a death sentence from the Bolsheviks. As we will see, however, it is wrong to label the Baron as insane. He was cruel and abhorrent in his ways, certainly genocidal in the style of Genghis Khan's Mongolian troops, irritable and at times bipolar, but not irrationally insane. The worldview and activity of the Baron was backed up by a highly moralistic system of beliefs, a system of beliefs that is extremely foreign to most people today and inherently calls for acts of cruelty, and yet a system of beliefs that resonated with a significant amount of people only some 100 years ago. The Baron was an extreme and despicable final product, centuries in the making, an overdrive of aristocratic elitism, of glorifying war and all its related brutalities, of serving the imperial cause with no regard for death. In short, a raging summation of the entire European imperial age. One could sit with the Baron and be convinced of his sanity after an evening conversation. In fact, several Russian refugees of an educated background that happened to meet the Baron would all exclaim in their later personal writings that this was a very determined and ideologically motivated man, and not simply some insane pseudo-mystic. Even Bolsheviks would write such things about the Baron, those who were able to see him in the final days of his life. However, none would venture to discount his abhorrent cruelty. Following this head injury in 1910, the Baron was summoned to officers' court and punished with a transfer out of the regiment to a far less prestigious, albeit Cossack, regiment. For the next 2 years, the Baron continued his life in typical fashion. He trained during the day, excelling in all forms of cavalry exercise, proving himself to be an extremely talented soldier, and during the evenings he would drink vehemently. Motivated by the headaches from his recent injury, he would practically terrorize his comrades, and yet act very proper indeed and apologize greatly for his behavior in the following mornings. The military seemed to make their eventual peace with this. In fact, in 1912, the Baron was promoted to company leader, now being directly in charge of 100 men. Perhaps it is during this time that the Baron first came to see that an approach of cruelty can be balanced out by personal excellence, and careful measured doses of kindness toward his men at the appropriate time, taking after the methods of Genghis Khan. However, as time went on, these acts of kindness became more and more rare, and eventually the Baron stopped apologizing for being who he was. During this time, in 1911, news of a Mongolian revolution against the Qing dynasty reverberated throughout Russia, signaling what was yet to come for the other empires. The Baron, sensing an opportunity to move further to the east and participate in seemingly glorious battle, put in for leave of absence and made his way to Mongolia, where he hoped to attach himself to Mongolian forces and assist them in their struggle against the Chinese. The story of this journey remains as one of the most peculiar yet innocent moments of his explosive life. We use the term innocent here because everything else that the Baron came to be famed for occurred with a large dose of violence. However, this tale is a moment of pure adventure. For reasons unknown, the Baron made the journey from St. Petersburg to Urga, the capital of Mongolia, all by himself on horseback. His only companion for a majority of the journey was a dog. The Baron traveled approximately 3,500 miles by himself, and it is very likely that he did it simply for the sake of doing so. It is reported that he arrived in Mongolia in extreme filth. His boots were destroyed by the precarious conditions of varying climates and environments along his journey. His uniform was long unwashed, his hair grown out, dry, damaged by the sun, as was his skin. His crystal blue eyes were the only remaining pure aspect of his physical appearance. Unfortunately, and in part due to having made this long journey, the Baron was ignored. Outer Mongolia had been liberated, at least for now, from the crumbled Qing dynasty, and Inner Mongolia remained under the control of the Chinese due to a much higher level of Han demographic integration and the complexity of its administrative systems. For a long time it was claimed, however, that the Baron did indeed participate heavily in this struggle. Popular rumor designated him as a collaborator of the mysterious and savage warlord Zha Lama, famed for his liberation of the city of Khoft, where he is alleged to have ripped out the hearts of his prisoners as sacrifice to the Tibetan gods, afterwards skinning them to use as leather for his yurts. It is impossible to know whether any of this is true, or whether this is yet again the historical tendency to turn the steppe into a place of fanatical stories. But what is now definitely known is that the Baron had no interaction with the Zha Lama. Recollections from the side of the Mongolians at this time make no mention of any Baron whatsoever, while the historical claim was that the Baron led the Zha Lama and his several thousand men as a great Tsarist commander. It is worth noting that the Zha Lama hated everything associated with the Russian Empire just as much as he hated his Chinese oppressors. The Baron finally found employment in the convoy forces of the Russian consulate in Mongolia, where he remained for a very quiet year of local study. He traveled as much as he could to local sites and places of divine importance. He studied the Mongolian tongue and began to habitualize the various customs and rites of the native Mongolian peoples. However, the Baron yearned for war. A newspaper correspondent who happened to speak with him at this time as a soldier of the convoy troops remarked how the Baron was utterly fascinated by the mechanics of war, making war as a profession, the same as farming or tailoring, with its own beauty of skill. The Baron, a decade after his time at school, still bragged about his fallen soldier ancestors. He said that 18 generations of soldiers had fallen in the service of the Russian Empire or some similar noble cause, and he is well aware that the same fate stands before him as well. In July of 1914, upon receiving news that the Russian Empire is joining the First World War and seeing that the Mongolian theater had by all means passed the peaks of its wartime potential, the Baron excitedly rushed back to St. Petersburg, seeking blood and glory. Over the next 3 years, the Baron would incessantly find himself in various corners and battles on behalf of the Russian Empire, finally having the opportunity to see real, continuous war. He was seriously wounded 5 times, and yet he returned to the front lines each time as quickly as possible, never letting his wounds heal properly. The 28-year-old Baron was quickly assigned to the 34th Don Cossack Regiment, with which he earned his first and most significant medal, one that he would wear with pride until the very day of his execution, the Order of St. George, 4th class. To this day, the highest honor that can be bestowed upon a Russian military man, although this honor itself is separated into 4 classes, with very few individuals ever reaching the 1st class. This honor was awarded to the Baron for a great display of courage and spawned the very first myth about him. The story goes that the Baron and several men found themselves face to face with an occupied point brimming with soldiers and under constant fire. The Baron, fluent in German, shouted to the enemies that they were shooting at their own men. His justification for approaching them from the Russian side is that they were executing disruptive tactics and were forced to retreat suddenly. The Austrians stopped their fire, and the Baron's men got up, at which point the Austrians saw their uniforms and opened fire again. The Baron, surrounded by a storm of bullets, shouted yet again to the Austrians, informing them that these uniforms were a disguise, and that they must stop shooting immediately. The Austrians fell for this, and the Baron's men entered the occupied point freely, which then allowed them to liquidate the Austrian force from the inside. The official decision to award the Baron with the Order of St. George does not give such a story. The committee honored the Baron for providing information which led to successful measures against the enemy, and nothing more. The accuracy of this episode, like many others in the life of the Baron, will never be confirmed. But it is here that the Baron first showed to his Cossack men that he can stand tall amid a storm of bullets, unflinching and unhurt. Toward the end of 1914, the Baron was reassigned to the 1st Nerchinsky Cossack Regiment. This is a unit of historical importance, for not only the Baron had the opportunity to serve in it as company commander, but it also contained two other famous actors of the coming civil war, General and Cossack Ataman Grigory Semyonov and General Pyotr Wrangel, the latter being perhaps the most well-known face of the White Army. While Pyotr Wrangel is of little relevance to the future activity of the Baron, his acquaintance with Grigory Semyonov, first made in this regiment, was foundational to the second period of the Baron's life, a life that was set to end in a short 7 years from now. With this Cossack regiment, the Baron earned another military honor, the Order of St. Anna, 4th class, quote, for bravery. He stayed with this regiment for close to a year, continuing to live a life of constant warfare on the Austrian front, suffering injuries and yet refusing to retreat. Unfortunately, it must be mentioned that the Baron continued to drink heavily, and still had a reputation of a violent, irritable man among his comrades. It just so happened that he was also an excellent military asset, utterly fearless and welcoming of death at any moment. Blind eyes had to be turned, as much as it was possible to do so, to the emotional instability of this courageous warrior. In September of 1915, the Baron was reassigned to the Special Cavalry Regiment of Ataman Punin, a partisan division of its only kind, i.e. made up entirely of East Prussian locals fighting for the Russian imperial cause. For close to a year, this regiment carried out disruptive tactics in the enemy's danger territory, the rear of the Prussian front. Again, for bravery in the face of severe battles and very risky activities of infiltration, the Baron was honored twice. He received the Order of Saint Stanislav, 3rd class, and the Order of Saint Vladimir, 4th class. The Baron found himself again with the Nerchinsky Cossacks and Grigory Semyonov by August 1916. The regiment was headed for western Ukraine. He was shortly promoted to the rank of Yesaul, i.e. a Cossack captain, and received yet another honor for outstanding military performance, the Order of St. Anna, 3rd class. Shortly thereafter, the wartime activity of the Baron came to a very sudden halt, with nobody to blame but himself. In a drunken rage, the Baron attacked several officers in October of 1916, and the Cossacks put in a request to have him appear in military court. It seems that his drunken outbursts had gotten too severe. Even the Cossacks, who were widely famous for their rowdy drinking, could no longer handle the Baron. After a court-martial, the Baron was discharged from the Nerchinsky Cossack regiment and sentenced to 2 months in prison. Nothing is known about his conduct during his imprisonment. Following his release in early 1917, the Baron was determined to travel east and leave the Western theater behind. The reason behind his decision was never made properly clear. Perhaps he could not find any other regiment to be attached to, having soured his possibilities through one too many reckless nights of drinking. Ultimately, there is no way to know. But the Baron set the far eastern city of Vladivostok as his destination. For yet another unknown reason, the Baron instead found himself in the Caucasus, the front line of the Russian Empire's war against the Ottomans, where he was reunited with his friend from the Nerchinsky Cossack regiment, Grigory Semyonov. It is here that the Baron first began assembling so-called national divisions. Having recently seen how effective such partisan regiments can be, the Baron believed that this efficacy can be recreated yet again by making regiments on an exclusively ethnic basis. This was commonly considered to be a practice invented by the Baron himself. However, by this point, many empires, including the Russian Empire itself, had formed such divisions half unknowingly. In largely multi-ethnic societies like empires, men of common descent will tend to band together during moments of turbulence. In Persia, the Baron and Semyonov both participated in organizing Assyrian regiments. These units seemed to be very effective militarily, but this would not matter much longer. The February Revolution had begun. The imperial army began to disintegrate, and within 1 month the very last Tsar of the 200-year-old empire would abdicate. It goes without saying that this event confirmed all those earlier prophecies that the Baron foresaw during his time at the Pavlovsk Military Academy. The end of Russia had finally begun. The apocalypse was here. God had closed his eyes. With the establishment of the provisional government, Grigory Semyonov was appointed commissar in the Baikal region. Ethnically, he was part Buryat and had distinguished himself as a great regional asset during the Russo-Japanese War. The provisional government saw it fit to return him to the geographical environment where he truly shined, understanding the importance of securing the nation as it appeared by all means to decay under revolutionary pressure. The Baron, distressed by the political situation and seeing no hopes in the Western war effort, followed Semyonov to the Far East. It is also worth noting that according to the memoirs of Semyonov, both he and the Baron foresaw the coming civil war. Having glimpsed the potential of organizing national divisions, Semyonov claims that they left for the Far East in order to continue organizing military units on an ethnic basis, as a preemptive measure against the coming Soviet forces, who would most definitely seek to secure their influence in eastern Siberia and the Trans-Baikal. The rationale for this ethnic organizational basis was that the bonds of shared ethnicity would be stronger than the bonds of class that the communists were relying on. Funnily enough, these national divisions would in fact become a lot more ethnically diverse than the Soviet forces themselves. The Far East was still a region dominated by tribal conflict, and yet both Semyonov and the Baron managed to assuage these localized ethnic grievances in the name of resisting Sovietization. The October Revolution of 1917 effectively ended what we have so far referred to as the Baron's imperial period. Of course, the complexity. Firstly, the monarchy would not come back. The Bolsheviks were the uncompromising party, and they found more and more popular support in the fact that they refused to compromise with the provisional government and any other authorities, including the more moderate members of the political left. They were staunchly anti-monarchic, and thus entirely antithetical. Both Grigory Semyonov and the Baron pledged their allegiance to the fallen Romanov dynasty, seeing no other way forward than the complete restoration of the monarchic line through the brother of Tsar Nicholas II, the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. Secondly, anybody who opposed the communist cause and wanted to participate in military activity against the Soviets was now to become a member of the so-called White Army. Those who only opposed the Soviets ideologically, whether from within Russia or from abroad, were now members of the wider White movement. Although the White Army initially outnumbered the Red Army of the Soviets, it suffered from major issues. Both the Baron and Grigory Semyonov, as ideological opponents of communism and devotees to the Romanov dynasty, therefore became part of the White Army. Semyonov garnered temporary military support for the White cause from the Japanese, and fought against the Soviets in Siberia until late 1920, after which he was ultimately forced to flee and live out his life in China, exiled. There, he would continue political efforts for the White cause, but never saw combat again until his execution by hanging in 1946 on behalf of the Soviets. The Baron, on the other hand, although nominally a member of the White Army, had very different aims in mind that were not necessarily related to the Russian Empire itself, and the relationship between these two men withered rather quickly over ideological differences. However, for the next 3 years, their military activity was mostly of an inseparable character. In fact, until Semyonov's retreat in late 1920, for the purposes of simplicity, we can say that the Baron served under Semyonov. Having learned of the October Revolution, Semyonov and the Baron began to assemble their forces in the city of Chita. Here, both men were hit by a certain reality. The local populations were not as inflamed by the patriotic cause as they had hoped. The entire region seemed to be affected by a certain inertia. Semyonov and the Baron only managed to gather approximately a dozen loyal men by the start of 1918. Nevertheless, these men were enough. This tiny regiment, upon hearing that Red soldiers had arrived on the Russo-Manchurian border, set out to fight. It is alleged that they managed to clear 200 miles of the Far Eastern Railway before coming face to face with a battalion of 1,500 Soviets. Miraculously, the Soviets lost this engagement, and the two men established a stronghold along the railway in Dauria, which Semyonov left in the hands of the Baron while he himself continued to build his forces in the city of Chita. The Baron would remain here for the next 2 years, often making short trips to Mongolia and China with diplomatic aims. Of course, only when he wasn't occupied with battles and skirmishes in the Transbaikal region. The White Movement at that time was headed by Admiral Alexander Kolchak, a conservative but by no means a monarchist. Instead of aiming to re-establish the monarchy with the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, Kolchak considered a simpler approach that would, in theory, appeal to a wider mass of non-Bolsheviks, to reconvene the Constituent Assembly and determine, as a nation, where the future of Russia lies. For this reason alone, both Semyonov and the Baron mostly rejected the authority of Admiral Kolchak and acted according to their own visions for the future. Semyonov sought an alliance with the Japanese, while the Baron began to form his most passionate plan, the formation of the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire, carved out of eastern Siberia, Mongolia, and Manchuria, adhering to a hybrid Buddhist-Christian faith with a single monarch at its head. The Baron never imagined himself as a monarch. For many years, his reputation remained as a brutal seeker of power, a man who wanted to carve his way to a throne. But the Baron himself never expressed such dreams. Here, the motivation at play was always to be a kingmaker, a restorer of states, to place that which was ordained by God in its rightful place. Perhaps the life of a monarch was simply too boring for the Baron. The throne brings with it a wide array of domestic responsibilities, daily reviewing of administrative activity, diplomatic meetings, parades and appearances for the people, and a monarch in battle always runs the risk of sudden death. It is men like the Baron who fight in the name of the monarch, pacifying their own restlessness and ensuring the continuation of the divine throne, no matter what level of cruelty is demanded of them. Dauria, the Baron's center of operations during this time, never developed into anything more than a military outpost. Here, more and more enthralled by the possibility of separating from the white cause and pursuing his own king-making path, the Baron formed the Asiatic Cavalry Division. This was a multi-ethnic national division, composed of the various peoples found in eastern Siberia and general Far East. For the time being, this 800-strong division was still in the service of the White Army, and the Baron commanded over it as it ravaged its way against constant waves of Bolsheviks in the Transbaikal. It was at this time that the Baron began to let his cruelty run loose, aimed at both the Soviet occupiers and his own men. Legend says that the Baron's outpost was full of corpses and bones. In the office of his headquarters, it is said that he had several dogs to which he would feed the decapitated heads of Soviet soldiers, using the clean skulls as decorations on his shelves. When news would come that the Red Army had managed to capture some village or settlement, the Baron and his cavalry division would ride out as liberators and force the Reds to retreat. Whoever was left behind would be tortured and then executed, his belongings appropriated as loot, after which a customary cleansing of the settlement would begin. It is said that the Baron would gather all of the locals and determine whether they had communist sympathies by simply looking into their eyes. Those who were found suspect would be executed on the spot. Other locals who found such activity inspiring had the opportunity to join the Baron's cavalry division, but not before being questioned. The answer yes was expected to the following 3 questions. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in the Tsar? And are you of pure blood? Those who wanted to join but failed during this interrogation would be publicly humiliated by the other troops for their beliefs, and sometimes were suspected to be spies, attempting to infiltrate the division and finally bring down this menace so that the Reds could continue down to Mongolia. In these cases, these suspected spies were also executed. It is impossible to say how true any of this is. Each account of this time period contradicts the other, and some of the details seem utterly out of place, considering that all of this was happening only 100 years ago. It goes without saying that human cruelty knows no bounds, especially during times of war. But local support for the Baron was thriving during this time period, and beneath our romanticized view of the far eastern steppe, a truth remains that most individuals want nothing but a calm life of little turbulence and no terror. It would have been impossible to gather support if the Baron was truly inflicting as much terror as was later claimed. Despite this preponderance of historical question marks, some facts have been ascertained, whether through official military documentation or agreement between all sources. Mainly, these are two. The first fact is that the Baron began to take his life and health very seriously. The importance of his mission and his devotion to the cause of king-making demanded that he stop drinking. Furthermore, this demand was extended to his entire cavalry division. At this time, the Baron would begin flirting with the idea of an ascetic army. An army of Buddhist monk warriors who rejected all earthly pleasures, all attachment to earthly things, with only one goal to their life: the restoration and defense of Buddhist civilization in Central Asia. If their bodies were kept pure enough, the ancient Tibetan gods would deem them worthy vessels for incarnation, and thus these deities of war and protection would come to Rome and fight across the entirety of Asia. The Eurasian steppe would become a battlefield of titanic gods. Nothing from the extant documentation related to the Baron suggests that this plan was ever formalized. To the eyes of the historical record, the Asiatic Cavalry Division remained nothing but that, a regular cavalry regiment that would be disbanded upon the Baron's capture in late August of 1921. However, what we do know is that the Baron himself treated his men with the most severe cruelty in the name of discipline. Anybody caught gambling, drinking, or even fornicating would be publicly flogged as an example. Those who continued to commit offenses regularly, despite the public punishment, would eventually be executed, once again in the name of behavioral purity. Of course, the Baron would not have lasted long in such a division when he himself was younger, but what becomes clear at this point is that the Baron preferred to discipline others and not be disciplined himself. In his younger years, we see few constants, but one is unavoidable. The Baron cannot be disciplined. The Baron shall do as he desires, and others shall do as he demands. The second fact that cannot be denied about this time period is that the Baron, much like the rest of the White Movement, as well as the Soviets themselves, supported his troops almost entirely through requisitions. The price of being liberated from the Reds was giving up your goods and produce for the benefit of the Asiatic Cavalry Division. Ultimately, it is the common people of the entire Eurasian region who suffered the most from the turbulence of Russia's 20th century politics. During the Civil War, the regular household had to live in constant awareness of the fact that one day either a red or a white would come to sustain himself on your life's work, all in the name of ideological struggle. Regardless of how much the two sides attempted to make these requisitions seem willful in the plethora of surviving memoirs, the truth is never that pleasant. These requisitions on behalf of the Baron are not made any better by his lifelong romanticization of the nomadic Cossack lifestyle. Russian literary culture elevated the Cossacks to a savage yet incredibly mysterious and romantic level. Those who had historical experience of being neighbors with the Cossacks would never fall for such romanticization, but it is especially true of the nobility, who had little exposure to any other people but themselves, and had plenty of time to bury themselves in the romantic notions of fictionalized literature, that they would very often struggle to put reality ahead of their romantic ideas. The Baron was never disillusioned by the groups and people he most admired, and in his case, the Cossack lifestyle of common drunken banditry was perhaps the most suitable to his extremely fluctuating temperament. Thus, the Baron never saw any issue with taking an often violent cut from the locals as payment for his acts of liberation. All throughout 1919, the Baron was either disciplining and growing his cavalry division, fighting the Reds, or traveling to Mongolia and China on diplomatic missions. He had gotten in contact with quite a few individuals of importance among the monarchist circles of the region, and was attempting to solidify an alliance with the most powerful Manchurian warlord, Zhang Zhuolin, who went on to become the leader and generalissimo of the Republic of China in 1927. This alliance was intended to serve Grigory Semyonov much more than the Baron himself. As we will see shortly, the Baron's personal allegiances lied with Mongolia against her Chinese occupier. However, at this point, as the Bolsheviks grew in military strength, there was little choice but to forget personal preference and play the most pragmatic hand. His negotiations appeared to go well. In fact, it led to a political union. The Baron married a Manchurian princess in July of 1919, the relative of a Chinese commander in the western part of Manchuria. This was an Orthodox wedding, and the couple communicated in their only shared tongue, English. However, by this point, the Baron was almost entirely dedicated to chastity, and his own troops would have quickly turned on him if they saw him participating in acts that he so often brutally punished among his own men. Despite the evident but slow success of his diplomacy, the Bolsheviks continued to grow in size and wage continuous war on the eastern part of the White Army, convincing more and more locals to fight in the name of communism. The leader of the White Army, Admiral Kolchak, was captured and executed on the 7th of February 1920 in Irkutsk. All of the eastern troops under his command were transferred to Grigory Semyonov, overwhelming his leadership capabilities. The White Army men began to riot, loot, and destroy as a final outburst in the face of what seemed to be a looming defeat in the eastern theater of war. At the same time, the Japanese began to withdraw their financial and military support that they had been up to this point providing to Semyonov. This was in accordance with the Gongota agreement between Japan and what Chita would shortly become once the Reds finally broke through, the Far Eastern Republic, one of the founding members of the Soviet Union. This series of blows to the white movement made Semyonov rethink his approach, and thus he abandoned the Transbaikal and headed for the depths of Manchuria. This marks the end of the partnership between Semyonov and the Baron. Sensing the sudden hopelessness of the local Siberian situation, the Baron officially detached his Asiatic Cavalry Division from the White Army and abandoned his Daurian outpost. With the White Army hopelessly flailing, it was time to become a kingmaker. What follows now is the true highlight of the Baron's life. Within a year, he is going to be dead, publicly executed by firing squad after a 6-hour show trial ordered by Lenin himself. And yet this short year is responsible for the fact that the Baron remains such a fascinating character for study. It is in this year that the Baron would come as close as he ever would to his grand goals of divine kingmaking. By all means, this episode, had the Baron been luckier and more careful, more restrained, could have been the beginning of a mythical empire-building legacy. The Baron could have facilitated the eventual coming of a second Genghis Khan. And yet it is the Baron's most personal traits that destroyed his own potential. On a long enough time frame, every act of cruelty comes back around. Outer Mongolia enjoyed its autonomy for several years following the 1911 Mongolian Revolution. The Qing dynasty had crumbled, but China did not give up its ambitions for power in the region. Under a confluence of events too complicated to cover in this essay, the Chinese marched into the capital of Urga in late 1919 and abolished the autonomy of what was up until now the Bogd Khaganate, i.e. Outer Mongolia. The theocratic holy ruler that was put in place as the spiritual and political leader of the nation in 1911, the Bogd Khan, was placed under house arrest and stripped of all political power. The Baron was aware of this, but did not act upon it due to the greater diplomatic requirements of the Transbaikal. Even though he mostly acted alone, he did still generally consider himself attached to Grigory Semyonov. However, as the Transbaikalian situation rapidly deteriorated in 1920, the Baron's eyes began to slowly drift toward this situation in Mongolia. In fact, the Baron quite openly stated his desire to eventually assist in the Mongolian cause against the Chinese, and had exchanged letters with the deposed Bogd Khan on this very subject. As Semyonov fled from the Transbaikal, the Baron finally received the Bogd Khan's written support for his ideas, that he must go rogue with the Asiatic Cavalry Division and storm the Chinese-occupied Urga in the name of restoring the holy ruler once again. On October 1st, 1920, the Baron entered Outer Mongolia. Arriving just outside the capital of Urga, the Baron attempted to first negotiate with the Chinese. A list of demands was presented, which amounted to a total disarmament of the occupying forces. Naturally, all such demands were rejected sternly. Several assaults were attempted by the Baron in late October and November, all to no avail. Disheartened and yet never unmotivated, the Baron decided to retreat and build up his forces. The next 4 months would be spent raiding Chinese trains and outposts, while also rallying local Mongolians for the liberation cause. The Baron's cavalry division doubled in size, as did his disciplinary action. Every thief, gambler, and drinker was to be violently beaten. It is reported that one soldier guilty of rape was burned alive for all to see. Those attempting to desert the unit, or those who even spoke of such things, would be brutally tortured and most often executed. Nevertheless, the division grew rapidly. Local Mongolians unable to fight gave what they could to the Baron's men, mostly food. Local noblemen provided horses and clothes to replace the worn-down and beaten equipment of the nomads. In the meantime, the Chinese occupation of Urga tightened. The highly important Buddhist temples were turned into command centers, denying the locals their freedom of religion. Many citizens were arrested under the charge of separatism, their personal belongings and property being thus seized for the benefit of the occupying Chinese. Militarily speaking, the Chinese appropriated all weaponry and dug a system of defensive trenches all around Urga, being certain that they will see the Baron again, and indeed they would. A complex plan of recapturing Urga was developed by the Baron and his right-hand men. 200 men were assigned to the rescue of the Bogd Khan from his house arrest, while the remaining 1,500 men of the Baron's cavalry division would assault Urga at the start of February. Indeed, on the 2nd of February, the Baron and his soldiers would decimate the first defensive front line of the Chinese and recapture a section of Urga. It is worth noting that the Chinese forces numbered 7,000 men against the Baron's 1,500. While this battle raged, the rescue team successfully infiltrated Urga from another direction and extracted the Bogd Khan, placing him in a nearby monastery for his safety to await the city's full liberation. On the following day, the Baron issued an order. Members of local resistance groups, as well as the cavalry division, were to spread out around the city in small camps and light campfires in every single one. This would create the impression that the liberation force is much bigger than it actually was, and that it had the capital entirely surrounded. This is a tactic that Genghis Khan himself became famous for 700 years prior, and one must imagine the joy that the Baron felt at being able to follow in his footsteps. The next morning brought with it victory. All of the forces under the Baron entered Urga, splitting up efficiently to take different districts, using their sabers and explosives. They swept through the city and cut down approximately 1,500 Chinese soldiers, while the total casualties for the Baron's men were only 60. The Chinese commanders and soldiers all fled. Those who could not retreat fast enough were naturally cut down. Urga had been liberated. However, this great act of liberation would very quickly be undermined by the Baron's own men. Again, we must remember that the main spirit of the Asiatic Cavalry Division was a Cossack one. The Baron attempted to keep it within bounds through severe discipline, but as history has shown time and time again, any act of forceful containment, of trying to bottle something, can also cause it to abundantly overflow. The culture of banditry and pillaging which seems so inherent to the nomadic warrior lifestyle could not be contained due to the explosive excitement over this victory. The Baron's men began to pillage, murder, and rape all the remaining Chinese civilians, individuals who had lived there peacefully for countless years, running businesses and trying to assimilate with the local Mongolians. Entirely innocent people. As he himself would later admit, the Baron allowed this to go on for several days. It is here that we must take notice of a very difficult subject to speak on, the Baron's virulent anti-Semitism. Anybody familiar with this period of history knows the plight of the Jewish people in Europe. The amount of violence and propaganda that these people suffered and would go on to suffer is impossible to ever truly grasp. The entire European nobility designated the Jewish people as their main enemy, and every individual of any importance during this time was to varying extents complacent in the suffering of the Jews. The Baron was no different. He was a product of his time and class, and as mentioned earlier, in many ways he was the final extreme summation of many ideas and sentiments. This was no different in regards to the widespread European anti-Semitism that had been festering for centuries. It is said that the Baron passionately hated two groups of people more than he hated anything else: the Bolsheviks and the Jews. It was in Urga that this hate manifested most intensely, although we can also very easily speculate about numerous earlier acts of violence against local Jews wherever the Baron went. But what happened in Urga was a full-blown genocide. Written evidence shows the Baron calling for the liquidation of all local Jews. Only a handful of exceptions were made, written notes stating that certain Jewish individuals were to be spared for reasons not entirely known. Regarding everybody else, the Cossacks had the freedom to do unto them whatever they desired. The result of this was the total elimination of the Jewish community in Urga. The community itself was never particularly large to begin with, but had they been left in peace, the community would have definitely grown to a respectable size today. Instead, there are less than 100 Jews currently residing in Ulaanbaatar, the current name of Urga. All of them are Russian expats, of no relation to the victims of the Baron's cruelty. After several days of terror, the Baron ordered all pillaging to stop. It goes without saying that certain parts of his forces still continued to inflict terror independently in the name of clearing out alleged Bolshevik infiltrators. On the 21st of February, the Baron, alongside local men of influence, brought the rescued Bogd Khan back to his newly liberated home. The following day, with the local Buddhist temples being reopened, a citywide worship was in place, for the Bogd Khan was yet again sworn in to his throne. After years of seeking glory across Eurasia, the Baron had finally achieved the first iteration of his long-term goals. He had made a king. In order to pay glory to his liberation efforts, the Baron was given the highest hereditary title in Mongolia, making him a Khan, not the monarch, as many have claimed in the past, but one degree below this. The only man in this newly liberated state that now had authority over the Baron was the Bogd Khan himself. The men of the Cavalry Division were also given various honors and titles. After many years of wanting to make an impact on the steppe, the Baron had finally elevated his name to the historic. If all else was to fail, the history of Mongolia would still occasionally whisper his name. Until late May of 1921, the Baron remained in Urga. He did not involve himself whatsoever in any of the affairs that the Mongolians kept themselves busy with. The Bogd Khan oversaw the opening of a military academy and a national bank. Administrative systems were improved and refined. Looted businesses and hospitals were set back in order. The typical consequences of newly acquired peace. The Baron, meanwhile, continued to discipline his men as he formed the next steps of his plan to build the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire. The only involvement of the Baron in local life came from his right-hand men within the cavalry division. They were still searching for spies, killing anybody with even a shred of Bolshevik sympathies, and tying up what they saw as loose ends with the few remaining local Jews. All in all, it is estimated that the Baron was personally aware of close to 1,000 individuals that had been killed by his cavalry division since the time of their victory in Urga, i.e. during peacetime. And the Baron took no actions to ever dissuade his closest associates from inflicting terror. The only actions he did take was to discipline his men, as a way of avoiding stagnation while he planned their military future. Just as before, his own men were whipped and at times executed for anything that did not align with the Baron's personal lifestyle. There was no celebratory drinking to be had in honor of the successful campaign on Urga. No man was to satisfy his biological needs in the comforting arms of a woman, lest he be brutalized for diverging from the path of purity. It must unfortunately be said that the Baron's high status in Mongolia very quickly dissipated as the locals saw and heard more and more of his unashamed cruelty. Of course, we must be mature. For troops to be most effective, they need to be disciplined, and this discipline must be relentless. But no good commander ever dismisses the value of praise and rest. By this point, the locals having heard of how the Bolsheviks were sweeping through the Russian nation, there were very little illusions about the future. Grigory Semyonov had fled. The White Army had crumbled on all fronts, and no matter how strictly disciplined, a division of approximately 2,000 men would stand no chance against the Red Army without some form of centralized leadership. The Baron had turned his back on the White cause, and now saw the restoration of the Russian monarchy as a possible byproduct amid the formation of the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire. The stragglers from the various branches of the White Army could be rallied and attached to the Cavalry Division, but they would have to reorient themselves toward the Baron's vision for Central Asia. To many, the activity of the Baron this late into the Russian Revolution seemed pointless. The Bogd Khan himself did not entirely support the Baron's vision for the future either. As far as he was concerned, the Baron had served his purpose. He could now remain in Mongolia as a warrior and protector of the state, but after years of struggle for autonomy, Outer Mongolia simply did not have the resources to fund the Baron's grand plans. Some historians are of the opinion that the Bogd Khan's Mongolia had no choice but to immediately become subservient to one of the Eastern powers if it wanted to avoid Sovietization. But by July of that same year, the Soviets would have already captured Urga. Mongolia was now to become a Soviet satellite state until the USSR's collapse in 1991. On the 21st of May, 1921, the Baron began his northern campaign. The rationale behind suddenly deciding to attack Soviet territory is not entirely clear. The current consensus seems to be that the Bolshevik threat and presence in the region was quite rapidly ballooning, and thus this became the top priority for every anti-communist in the region, including the Baron, even though his true ambitions were to go west and rally further Mongolian, Chinese, and other Asian troops for the Cavalry Division. At this time, the Baron issued his most famous order, Order Number 15, an announcement and battle cry for all anti-Bolsheviks in Eastern Russia. An extract reads as follows: "Among the people, we can see disappointment and the distrust of others. They now require names to rally around, names known to all, dear and honored names. There is only one such name, the rightful master of the Russian land, the Emperor of all Russia, Mikhail Alexandrovich. In our struggle against the criminal destroyers and desecrators of Russia, we must remember that with the current absolute decadence of morals and complete mental and bodily depravity seen in Russia, it is impossible to be guided by principles of old. There can only be one extent of punishment now, the death penalty. The old foundations of justice have changed. There is no truth and mercy anymore. Now there shall be truth and merciless severity. The evil that came to this earth to destroy the divine element in the human soul must be uprooted." What the Baron did not know when issuing this statement is that his rallying figure was no longer alive. In fact, the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich had died 3 years prior. He was the first Romanov to be executed by the Bolsheviks, and the local authorities covered the story up, claiming that he was either kidnapped or had fled the country. Regardless, Order Number 15 is perhaps the clearest existing formulation of the Baron's worldview and his highly specific, yet unyielding, personal sense of morality. His view of the enemy was reciprocated. He viewed the communists as the morally evil force of the world, uprooting every tradition and everything that made the land divine, while the communists viewed the Baron as a manifestation and final sum of an evil tradition. To both, the other party was the definition of the world's failures, the failures of human nature, traits and beliefs allowed to fester when they should have been entirely eradicated instead. For the purposes of waging war on Soviet-occupied territory in eastern Siberia, the Baron split the Asiatic Cavalry Division into two parts, one headed by himself and the other under the command of Major General Boris Rezukhin, one of the Baron's closest right-hand men. The Baron's portion, at this time, numbered approximately 2,100 men. Rezukhin's was a little bit smaller, 1,500. Approximately 500 men were left behind in Urga as a reserve force, in case the Baron and his men had to retreat and defend Urga itself. Rezukhin's division was aimed at disrupting the Red Army in its rear, while the Baron's part fought them face on. For the next 3 weeks, despite the fact that the Red Army was significantly larger and better equipped, both divisions saw some success. However, during a 3-day battle from the 11th to the 13th of June, the Baron saw what was arguably the biggest defeat of his life while fighting at Troitskosavsk. Approximately 60% of his cavalry division was killed, around 1,300 men. This was a point from which the Baron would recover temporarily, but not permanently, and thus began his slow death. The Red Army, with assistance from local Mongolian sympathizer forces, entered Urga on the 6th of July, at which point it found that the city had essentially been abandoned by the anti-Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, the Baron sought to reunite his split division, and managed to do so by July 18th, from where it made its final campaign. On August 1st, 1921, the Baron won a battle at Gusiное озеро in Buryatia, where he captured 300 Red Army soldiers and over 500 pieces of equipment. This defeat sent fear through the Red leadership, and they dedicated even more effort to strengthening the region. The Baron himself is claimed to have been very disappointed by the fact that the locals weren't willing to revolt against the Reds, as they did some years earlier when he was assembling his forces in Dauria. As far as he could tell, the local Buryat population had no issue with Sovietization, and so, fearing that the locals would assist the Reds in surrounding him, as well as hearing rumors of an even larger force being on its way, the Baron decided to retreat into Mongolia. On the way, the Baron lost yet another battle due to issues of equipment on the 5th of August. The Red Army had armored cars mounted with machine guns, something that the cavalry division never used. Horses are much faster and easier to keep. The Russian Civil War as a whole is littered with stories of military vehicles breaking down at the most important moments, becoming a gigantic yet still extremely valuable burden. Countless men on both sides of the Civil War lost their lives while attempting to stay behind in recently captured enemy territories in order to fix their armored cars. On the 11th of August, the Baron split the cavalry division into two parts yet again. Boris Rezukhin's portion was to cover the Baron's retreat towards Urenhai, modern-day Tuva. They reached this location successfully within only a few days, but the Baron found it far too unsafe geographically, and so he set his eyes on Tibet. To this day, the Baron's relationship with the Tibetan authorities is difficult to ascertain. At the time, it was widely believed that he had the support of the 13th Dalai Lama, and his cavalry division did indeed have several Tibetans in it. His personal proclivity for Buddhism certainly played into this, and Tibet was to be included in his Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire. If not as part of it, then at least as a close ally and example of what a Buddhist theocracy looks like. For the Baron, Tibet was an entirely mystical land, as it still is for many of us today, and it certainly fed into his wider beliefs. After all, the Baron fit perfectly into the Buddhist Shambhala prophecy, which stated that the world shall be consumed by evil on behalf of barbarian forces. A warrior is then to come in order to preserve the kings and defeat the enemies of the Dharma, restoring every fallen king in the process as well. In short, a kingmaker was to come during a moral apocalypse. The aforementioned order number 15 confirms that the Baron did indeed think in these prophetic terms. The much more likely reality of the situation is that the Baron had no formal ties to Tibet. It is known that he had never visited the land, even though he always intended to, and perhaps we can speculate that had the Baron lived longer, he would have definitely involved the Dalai Lama in his plans. For the current moment, however, there was not much there for the Baron to gain except a potential new outpost. Unfortunately, the Baron's men were not up for this journey. Everybody closest to the Baron at this time saw a trip to Tibet as a guarantee of death. It was far too perilous. There was no guarantee that the Chinese wouldn't intercept them on their way, and the Baron had no knowledge of the land. Plotting an uncharted journey when the entire region is teetering on the brink of Sovietization was far too dangerous. Of course, danger was never a concern for the Baron himself. The medals he earned in World War I all confirmed this, and even those who went on to describe the Baron as utterly depraved still agreed that this was a fearless and brave man despite all his other faults. However, the average man is simply not that brave. History presents us very few examples of men truly careless in the face of death when compared to the large multitude who at some point do act out of fear. And so, naturally, the Baron's men began to plot his removal. Years of cruelty and danger had finally boiled over. On the night of the 17th of August, the Baron's right-hand man Boris Rezukhin was murdered by his officers, and his part of the division began retreating to Manchuria. The following night, as the Baron slept, his soldiers began shooting at his tent. The Baron managed to escape unharmed. The soldiers executed every officer still loyal to the Baron. The next morning, he attempted to make peace with his division, but they shot at him and he was yet again forced to flee. They then made their way back to Manchuria as well. Effectively, this was the end of the Asiatic Cavalry Division. On the 19th of August, the Baron found one last remaining reserve detachment of his cavalry division, a unit made up almost entirely of Mongolians. He seemed to have temporarily swayed them to continue the struggle, but this all came crashing down when he demanded that they execute the few Russians in their detachment on the basis of them being potential spies or mutineers. The Mongolians refused, allowed the few Russian members of their detachment to escape, and then arrested the Baron on the morning of the 20th. It is said that they would have preferred to execute him on the spot. However, they seriously doubted whether the Baron could actually be killed. Their plan was to hand him over to the few remaining authorities of the local white movement that would continue fighting the Reds in small capacity until October of 1922. The whites would probably imprison him or find some way to penetrate his immortality and put an end to his cruel but tenacious life. However, on their way to the whites, on the 22nd, a unit of Red Army soldiers intercepted them and took all of them captive. They had heard of the mutiny that began 5 days prior, and had sent out a special reconnaissance unit specifically for the purpose of finding the lone, wandering Baron and capturing him. One of the individuals who later shared the tale of this capture stated that the Baron, even in captivity, did not go out quietly. When he saw the Red Army men descend onto the group of Mongolians, he began shouting commands to the Reds themselves, announcing that he is the Baron Ungern, and that they must help him escape his captivity. The goal of such a statement is difficult to determine. Perhaps the Baron thought he could overpower the Reds by nothing more than strength of character, and they would release him. Or perhaps he believed in the possibility of converting them to his cause. Nevertheless, this did not work, and the Baron was taken as prisoner to Novonikolaevsk. Here he was thoroughly interrogated, and those present for the interrogation would write in their memoirs and reports of the interrogation that the Baron, despite his unkempt appearance, presented himself as a very calm and rational man. He answered all questions honestly. In fact, he said he had no reason to lie at this point, since every man under his command had betrayed him. He admitted his intentions to commit suicide while in captivity, but his attempt at hanging himself had failed due to the thickness of his belt. Furthermore, the cyanide pill he kept in his jacket's front pocket at all times had recently went missing. He believes that one of his men, while organizing his tent and folding his clothes, accidentally made it fall out and did not notice. Reiterating that he could be frank now due to having been betrayed, he even gave advice to the Reds. He knew they would eventually unite with the revolutionary north of China and make a joint assault on the south, and so it would be better for them to do so in the winter, as they would have to cross the Gobi Desert. The climate there in the summer would be unbearable for the Red Army soldiers. The Baron admitted to numerous executions of both soldiers and civilians, all done by his order or even by his own hand. This included an execution of several children, which he described as tying up loose ends. He was also aware of all the terror committed by his right-hand men in Urga, including the genocide of local Jews and murders of Chinese civilians. However, when confronted with the fact that his men had raped several local women, he denied having any knowledge of this, and said he finds it hard to believe that anybody in the division would behave in this way, considering that the punishment was immediate death. The Baron revealed that the radio station in Urga had been used to intercept military messages throughout the entire region. He reiterated his lifelong belief that the aristocracy is the founding and guiding principle of all good, that Western culture was decadent and decayed, that a clashing of East and West is inevitable. The East is to replace the West. His evidence for the decadence of the West was the fact that left-wing revolution had been born there. He stated that he thought himself capable of writing a book on this subject, but hadn't had the time to do so up until now. The Baron confirmed that he had no clue at all about an upcoming mutiny and capture. Up until this point, he was still unaware of what exactly caused all of this to happen, but he suspected that a single commander from his division flamed the fires of mutiny. However, the Baron never gave a name for this suspect. He admitted that he did indeed have contact with the Kutuktu of Inner Mongolia, i.e. the living Buddha, one of the heads of Tibetan Buddhism in the Far East region. But otherwise he had acted entirely independently throughout most of his civil war life. His relationship with the living Buddha of Inner Mongolia is factual. They had met several times. But the living Buddha did not share any of the Baron's ambitions. In fact, the living Buddha, during the Baron's time in Urga, worked on improving diplomacy further with the Chinese and distancing Inner Mongolia from Outer Mongolia, with a special accent on the fact that the Baron did not appear to be a particularly strong nor reliant ally. The interrogation of the Baron is a significant document. It paints him as an ideologically motivated man, a violent man, but still human. It is clear that his behavior did not align with the moral code of neither Buddhism nor Christianity, and he was capable of an immense, deplorable cruelty. On the surface, this cruelty served his aims, yet one cannot help but consider his earlier years. As far back as the life of the Baron goes, it is underlined by disobedience and violence. How many of his later actions were simply a personal need to channel his seemingly inborn sadism? If the truth lies somewhere in the middle, then what is this middle for the Baron? From one perspective, he is an incarnation of evil and cruelty, standing for everything that has caused infinite amounts of torment and suffering to the human race. Yet, from another perspective, he is nothing more than a product of his times, a final summation of hereditary tradition, pushed to an unnatural level by the demands of the horrifically bloody revolution and civil war in Russia. Yet, a third perspective would have him labeled as the incarnation of the god Baekje, fulfilling an ancient prophecy, an actor on a stage that is much more spiritual and metaphysical than the simple confines of class conflict. Legend says that the god Baekje was once the ruler of the demons, an evil deity, but the third Dalai Lama saw promise in him and showered him with praise and honors, upon which Baekje left the world of demons and embraced the Dharma. He was now a figure of both sides. He retained the qualities that allowed him to effectively rule over the demons, i.e., a warring spirit capable of cruelty. His skin was red and his orange facial hair ablaze. 3 eyes filled with wrath. His shelter was a sea of blood. And yet, his inner spiritual qualities were ones of protection and obedience to Buddhist compassion. Sometimes a compassionate act is a cruel and necessary one. This is the moral of the Baekje story. It is easy to imagine why followers of the Buddhist faith assigned the cruel yet adamant Baron a likeness to this deity. Between these 3 perspectives, some form of truth can be ascertained, and it is the interrogation document that gives us the best glimpse of that truth. The capture of the Baron was made known immediately to all authorities, including Vladimir Lenin. On the 26th of August, Lenin commanded that they pay extra attention to the case of the Baron and properly investigate all the evidence against him. Quote, "If he can be proven guilty, which seems pretty indubitable, then he must be given a quick and efficient show trial, after which he must be shot." The trial was scheduled the following day for the 15th of September 1921. It was held in an outdoor theater in a Novonikolaevsk park, lasting approximately 6 hours. The case against him took 5 hours and 20 minutes to make. The final 40 minutes or so were spent deliberating and then sentencing, even though the outcome was already predetermined. 3 charges were brought against the Baron. The first, participation in armed conflict against the Soviet government under the influence of Japan. The Soviets believed that it was Japan who was simply using the Baron in order to build their empire within Central Asia. It has since been proven that this was not at all the case. The second charge, participation in acts of violence against civilians in war-affected localities. The third and final charge, participation in mass liquidation of both property and people in the war-affected localities. It goes without saying that regardless of the trial's verdict, the Baron was guilty on all 3 counts. He did wage war against the Soviet enemy. He did liquidate local communist sympathizing civilians, and the looting and killing in Urga was approved of by him. His men did this with full knowledge, at least as is claimed in the interrogation document. Throughout the 6-hour trial, the Baron continued to openly state his opposition to communism, left-wing ideology as a whole, and the Bolsheviks specifically. Certainly, he knew that this was the final day of his life. For all the warfare he had inflicted upon the Reds, he was now sure to pay. An escape was impossible, the area was far too controlled, and every local inhabitant knew that the Baron was there. His trial was a public spectacle. Even if he managed to escape, his division was gone. The interrogation shows that the Baron was quite bitter and offended by the mutiny of his men, perhaps even hopeless. It is hard to say whether the Baron ever understood that he is partially responsible for the loss of his own men, their trust and confidence. Urga was also gone. Semyonov was gone. Rizukhin was gone. The Kutuktu of Inner Mongolia seemed apathetic toward his ambitions, and the Bogd Khan was to die only 3 years later. This is not to say that there was nothing at all for the Baron out there. Nomadic men always find a way to get back on their horse in new regions, with new units. The wild steppe makes them resilient. But the age of the steppe had come to an end. The Soviets ensured this. The Baron was simply overpowered, and considering his ambitions, he was born far too late. The age of empires was also exhaling its final breath. That night, on the 15th of September 1921, Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was executed. Upon hearing of his death, the Bogd Khan ordered services to be held in his memory all throughout Outer Mongolia. Over the next few years, the Baron's reputation grew more and more surrounded in mystery. Memoirs of European soldiers labeled him a god of war. It was rumored that before his death he had buried a significant amount of treasure throughout Mongolia, and many men sought this treasure for years to come. People came forward with claims of being his descendants, claims that are highly unlikely due to the Baron's perception that sex was impure. The main and perhaps only lasting achievement of the Baron was his liberation of Outer Mongolia from the Chinese. In fact, had he not done so, Outer Mongolia would have been used as a base by the Chinese in order to resist Sovietization. In fact, a Soviet diplomat once stated in a letter to Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin that if not for the Baron, Mongolia would have become a significant opponent for the Reds, and its Sovietization would have been entirely impossible. It is an unfortunate turn of irony that in his efforts to liberate Outer Mongolia from his Chinese opponent, the Baron paved the way for his Soviet opponent to take it instead. Baron Ungern-Sternberg will remain a niche yet fascinating character of the Russian Civil War. a perennialist mystic operating through an eschatological world view, an utterly cruel man who justified his cruelty through what he believed to be an immensely strong sense of morality. Had fate desired for the Baron to succeed, we would have perhaps seen a grand sweeping empire worthy of Genghis Khan himself in Eurasia. The Baron, under different circumstances, could have been remembered as highly as Genghis Khan currently is in Mongolia. Golden statues would have been erected in his name, all his acts seen as necessary for the freedom of those local people. But such grand ambitions always have much in their way that can undermine them. The largest plans have the largest amount of critical points, areas of weakness that often depend entirely on luck. In this case, perhaps due to some metaphysical karmic force, luck was not on the Baron's side. One of the soldiers present in the Baron's Asiatic Cavalry Division, Dmitry Alyoshin, went on to write a memoir about his time with the division, The Asian Odyssey, first published in 1940. In this book, he gave the following as the mission statement that the Baron and his men wanted the world to hear. The whole world is rotten. Greed, hatred, and cruelty are in the saddle. We intend to organize a new empire, a new civilization. It will be called the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire, carved out of Mongolia, Manchuria, and eastern Siberia. Communication has already been established for that purposes with Zhan Zo-Lin, the warlord of Manchuria, and with Kutuktu, the living Buddha of Mongolia. Here, in these historic plains, we will organize an army as powerful as that of Genghis Khan. Then we will move, as that great man did, and destroy the entirety of Europe. The world must die so that a new and better world may come forth, reincarnated on a higher plane.